Have you ever been in a room and felt like you did not belong? Even when you had every reason to be there, Charlotte Evans was just an assistant. No Ivy League degree, no famous last name. So when a billionaire CEO brought her to a black tie gala, people laughed behind crystal glasses and whispered behind her back. She was not rich, she was not polished, but she was real. Imagine being her, surrounded by power, judged by your shoes, watched for every mistake, not because of what you said, but because of where you came from. What would you do, walk away, or rise anyway? This is not just a story about breaking into high society. It is about holding your ground when the world tells you to shrink. Stay with us, because what happens next just might change how you see worth. Forever. The city lights of San Francisco blinked softly beneath the thick glass walls of the penthouse office. Rain had come earlier than forecasted, so a fine mist still hung over the bay like a lace veil. Inside, the quiet hum of a central heating unit filled the space between polished stone floors and dark walnut bookshelves. It was nearly 10 p.m., but Nathaniel Pierce had not moved from his spot in front of the window. His hands were in his pockets. His jacket was off, neatly folded over the arm of a leather chair. The white dress shirt he wore was slightly wrinkled, sleeves rolled to the elbows. His tie sat undone around his neck, like a ribbon abandoned mid-celebration. He looked every bit the billionaire CEO that headlines loved to write about. Yet, in that quiet moment, he did not look powerful. He looked uncertain. Nathaniel was 38. He had built Pierce Technologies from scratch, not out of a garage, like most tech legends, but out of a hospital waiting room. At 25, he had watched his mother die slowly from a condition that could have been detected months earlier. That is, if her small-town clinic had the right equipment. After her passing, he did not rage. He did not cry. He studied. He built software. He built diagnostic models. He pored over data at night and chased investors during the day. He failed many times, but eventually, one grant turned into two. Then came the awards, then the features, then the partners. Pierce Technologies grew from a dream to a global enterprise with over 5,000 employees. His name became a brand. His face appeared on magazines. People called him a visionary. They also called him cold, guarded, emotionally unavailable. He did not argue with them. He had learned long ago that public opinion came and went like ocean tides. What mattered more was what he believed in when the world went quiet. And tonight, the world had gone very quiet. A folder sat open on the table behind him. Inside, an invitation printed on thick ivory paper shimmered under the desk lamp. Annual Philanthropy Gala, Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, Saturday, 6 p.m. He had attended every year. It was a showcase event. Every major donor, investor, and board member would be there. Cameras, speeches, applause, champagne that cost more than rent in most cities. This year, he had been asked to give the keynote address, but that was not why his stomach felt tight. He turned from the window and sat down. For the first time in a decade, Nathaniel was considering bringing someone, a personal guest, not a publicist-approved date, not a socialite with a polished smile and a background in nothing. He was thinking about Charlotte Evans. Charlotte had joined the company 2 years earlier as his personal assistant. She was not flashy. She was not from Stanford or Yale. She had sent in a handwritten thank you letter after her interview, which he had found oddly moving. There was a quiet clarity in her that disarmed even his most impatient days. She listened. She remembered things others did not. She spoke little in meetings, but when she did, her insights were sharp and human-centered. Once, after a particularly tense merger discussion, she had walked into his office, holding 2 mugs of tea, and said only, "Do not forget why you started this." He never did. But her words reminded him to be more than efficient. They reminded him to be human. Still, this world, the one he moved in now, it was not kind to people like Charlotte, people who wore sensible shoes, who shopped at local markets, who had never flown first class or owned a passport with embossed initials. Nathaniel had grown used to that world. He had made peace with the artifice of it. But tonight, something in him rebelled against it. He wanted Charlotte to be seen, not as a helper in the background, but as someone worth knowing, worth listening to. He reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over her contact. He hesitated. It was late. She was likely asleep. Still, his thumb moved. The phone rang once, twice. Then her voice came through, clear and gentle. Charlotte Evans speaking. Nathaniel cleared his throat. "Hi, Charlotte. I know it is late. I would not call unless it was important." He could almost hear her smile. "No worries. Is everything all right? Anything urgent for tomorrow, as schedule?" He paused. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something, not work-related. Would you consider coming with me to the gala this Saturday?" There was a moment of complete silence. Then she said, softly, "You mean, as your assistant, no, my..." Nathaniel said, firmly, "As my guest." He could hear her breathe in. "Nathaniel, I do not know what to say. I mean, I am honored, but I do not really fit in with that kind of crowd." "You do," he said, "more than you know." Another pause. "Let me think about it. I am flattered. Really?" He nodded, though she could not see it. "Of course. Take your time. The offer stands." When the call ended, Nathaniel remained seated. The rain had stopped. The city beyond the window shimmered like it had been wiped clean. He looked at the invitation again. For the first time in years, he felt nervous. Not about the speech, not about the investors, but about a woman who brewed tea in clay mugs and read poetry during lunch breaks. A woman who reminded him that greatness did not always wear silk or speak in practiced tones. Sometimes, greatness walked softly. And sometimes, it waited for an invitation. Charlotte Evans had never been to California before she got the job. She had flown in from Indiana with one suitcase, a pair of walking shoes, and a printed R sum that had coffee stains on the corner. The interview was in a gray building in downtown San Francisco. She had been told not to expect much. Pierce Technologies was known for being intense, fast-paced, filled with brilliant people who wore black turtlenecks and used 5-syllable words in casual conversations. Charlotte wore a navy blue cardigan and a skirt she had bought from a second-hand store in Bloomington. Her heels were modest, her makeup almost invisible, but she carried herself like someone who had learned how to be still in a loud world. She remembered walking into the waiting room and noticing how quiet it was, not the silence of peace, but the kind of quiet that came just before a thunderstorm. When Nathaniel walked into the room, she had expected someone larger than life. Instead, he looked tired, not worn out, but precise, like someone who counted energy the way others counted dollars. He asked her 5 questions. She answered each one simply. Then he asked her what she read. Charlotte said poetry, mostly modern, some older, a bit of Rilke, and a lot of everyday things too. Receipts, labels, the backs of cereal boxes. That made him laugh, not loudly. But it stayed in his eyes for a while. The offer came 2 days later. It had been 2 years since that first meeting. In that time, Charlotte had watched the world from the corners of rooms most people only saw in magazines, board meetings, shareholder calls, private flights, award shows, all from the background. She had never minded that. She liked being invisible. It gave her time to observe. She could see who people really were when they thought no one was watching. She knew who refilled their own coffee, who looked at phones during meetings, who only spoke when a camera was around. She noticed patterns, not just in data, but in people. Nathaniel never asked her to do more than she was paid for, but she often did. Not for approval, but because she believed in what the company was trying to do, and because, quietly, she believed in Nathaniel. But belief was one thing. Belonging was another. When she ended the call with him that night, Charlotte sat on the edge of her small bed. The window was cracked open. The sound of late-night traffic drifted in from below. A siren in the distance, a man yelling something to someone on the corner. And still, her mind went back to his voice. "Would you consider coming with me to the gala this Saturday as my guest?" She had replayed those words 3 times since they spoke, and now, her hands were sweating, even though the room was cool. She stood and walked into the small kitchenette, put the kettle on the stove. She needed tea. That always helped. As the water boiled, she looked at her calendar. She had nothing planned for Saturday. She almost never had plans. But that was not the point. The point was, Charlotte Evans had never been to a gala. She had never worn a floor-length dress. She had never eaten anything with gold leaf on top. She had never been someone people turned to stare at when she entered a room. She remembered the last company party she attended. It had been a winter gathering, casual. She had worn a green sweater. Someone asked if she was part of the catering team. She had smiled politely and said no. That had been the end of the conversation. She turned off the stove and poured the hot water into a chipped ceramic mug. She added a tea bag, chamomile, her favorite. She sat back down at the window, looked at the steam rising. It reminded her of cold mornings back home. Her mother standing at the sink, her father lacing up his work boots, the sound of a radio playing softly in the background. A world far away now, but not forgotten. Charlotte was not ashamed of where she came from, but she was realistic. People like Bradley Carrington would be there. She had seen him before, at conferences, on video calls, the way he looked at people who brought their own lunch to the boardroom. She took a deep breath. She was not foolish. She knew what this invitation meant. If she went, she would be judged. But if she did not go, she might always wonder, not about what others would think, but about what it might mean to say yes, just once, to step into the light, instead of always standing behind it. The next morning, Charlotte woke before her alarm. The sky outside was still pale, caught somewhere between night and morning. She sat in bed for a while, watching the ceiling. The air in the room was cool and quiet. Her tea mug from the night before still sat on the windowsill, now cold. She had barely slept. The invitation from Nathaniel had stayed with her like the echo of a song she could not forget. There had been nothing improper in his words, nothing dramatic, but something inside her had stirred. Not fear exactly, more like uncertainty wrapped in longing. As she got ready for work, she moved slowly. She picked a navy blouse, the same one she wore to last quarter's investor meeting. Clean, pressed, safe, on the train. She kept her hands folded on her lap. Outside the window, San Francisco moved past in fragments, gray buildings, morning fog, joggers on the sidewalk. The kind of life that looked polished from the outside, but always felt more complicated up close. When Charlotte arrived at the office, she walked the familiar path to the executive floor. Her ID badge clicked against the scanner. The elevator chimed. Nothing had changed, but she had, just a little. Nathaniel was already at his desk. He looked up as she entered and gave a slight nod. "Morning?" "Good morning," she replied. They said nothing more for a few minutes. The quiet between them was not uncomfortable. It never had been. It felt like standing next to someone at the edge of a cliff. Both aware of the view, both waiting to speak. Finally. She set the agenda folder on his desk and said softly, "I have been thinking about your invitation." Nathaniel looked up. He did not press. "I appreciate it, really." She continued, "But I do not know if I am the right person to be at that kind of event." He leaned back in his chair. "There is no right kind of person, Charlotte. There are just people worth hearing." She paused. "I do not have the right clothes. I would not know what to say to anyone there." "You know more than most of them," he replied, "about the things that matter." She did not answer. The conversation paused again. Then Nathaniel spoke, more quietly. "You do not have to say yes. I just wanted you to know I see what you bring, and I want others to see it too." Charlotte nodded. She left his office with more questions than answers. The rest of the day passed in the usual rhythm. Emails, schedules, briefings, coffee runs. Everyone around her moved with purpose, fast, sharp, precise, but Charlotte moved more slowly. Something had been shaken loose. That evening, when she returned to her apartment, she stood for a long time in front of her closet. The space was modest. A wooden rod held a small collection of work clothes, slacks, blouses, one formal black dress she had worn to a cousiness wedding 2 years ago. She touched the fabric. It was clean, simple, no designer label. But maybe, just maybe, it could be enough. She sat at the edge of her bed again, hands folded, and she remembered something her father once said. He had spoken those words years ago, when she had been too afraid to apply for her first scholarship. You do not belong anywhere until you decide to. She had not thought of that in a long time, but it felt like it mattered now. That night, she called Grace Martinez, a friend, a former colleague, someone who had always told the truth, even when it hurt. Grace picked up on the second ring. "Charlotte, please tell me the rumors are true." Charlotte smiled into the phone. "Which ones?" "That you got invited to the gala. As his actual guest, it was unexpected." "No," Grace said. "It was overdue." Charlotte was quiet. "I am not sure I fit in." "Grace, you fit where you choose to stand. And if anyone cannot see that, it says more about them than it does about you." Charlotte let that sit in her chest for a moment, then nodded, though Grace could not see. After they ended the call, she turned off the lights, but she did not sleep right away. Instead, she lay there, listening to the quiet. She thought of all the moments she had held back in life, the invitations she had declined, the compliments she had shrugged off, the doors she had never tried to open. Maybe this time, she could say yes, not because she wanted to be seen, but because she was tired of hiding and tired of pretending that quiet people did not have something worth offering. She reached for her phone and began to type, "Nathaniel, if the invitation still stands, I would be honored to attend." The message sat on the screen for a moment. Her thumb hovered, and then, with one steady breath, she hit send. The car pulled up slowly in front of the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art. The building shimmered under evening lights. Long glass walls reflected the city skyline behind rows of red carpet and golden ropes. Dozens of guests were already arriving. Men in sharp tuxedos. Women in floor-length gowns that whispered as they walked. Inside the car, Charlotte Evans stared out the window. Her palms were damp, her breath shallow. She wore the black dress from her cousin's wedding. A simple neckline, a gentle flare at the waist, nothing extravagant. She had added a strand of her late mother's pearls, the one piece of jewelry that held both history and grace. Beside her, Nathaniel Pierce adjusted his cufflinks. He looked composed, as always. But when he turned to her, his voice softened. "You do not have to say a word tonight if you do not want to. Just walk with me." Charlotte nodded. She tried to smile. The driver opened the door. As she stepped out, the first thing she noticed was the light. Bright, white flashes from camera bulbs. They sparked like fireworks across the night. Nathaniel offered his arm. She took it. The red carpet felt too wide. Each step echoed more than the one before. She could feel the eyes. Who is she? Is that his assistant? Why would he bring someone like that? None of the voices were loud, but they did not need to be. Charlotte could feel them like wind pushing against her skin. They walked inside. The entrance hall opened into a massive atrium. Sculptures floated on mirrored pedestals. Waiters carried trays of champagne and water in thin-stemmed glasses. The room glowed in gold and ivory. Nathaniel leaned close. Do not let the shine fool you. Most of them are just trying to look comfortable. Charlotte allowed herself a breath, then another. They moved through the room slowly. Nathaniel stopped to greet a few familiar faces. He introduced Charlotte each time, using the same words. "This is Charlotte Evans, a brilliant member of our team." Some smiled, some nodded politely, but some looked past her, as if she were a prop in a picture, not a person with a story. She stood beside Nathaniel, quietly observing. A woman in a green satin gown glanced at her from head to toe. The look was brief, but unmistakable. Charlotte stepped slightly behind Nathaniel. Then came Bradley Carrington, tall, expensively dressed, the kind of man who always arrived 10 minutes late and expected others to wait. "Nathaniel," he said, with a bright but hollow grin. Nathaniel shook his hand. "Bradley. And this must be the mystery guest?" Bradley said, eyes narrowing. "I have to say, I was not expecting such simplicity." Charlotte looked at him calmly. "This is Charlotte Evans," Nathaniel said. "She has helped guide our company through the most important transitions of the last 2 years." Bradley's smile did not move. "Well, that is something." He turned to Charlotte. "I admire your courage. These events can be intimidating, especially for newcomers." Charlotte met his gaze. "Everything is intimidating if you assume you are not welcome." There was a pause. Then Nathaniel let out a quiet laugh. "Well said," he added. They moved on. More glances. More murmurs. Charlotte tried to keep her focus. She noticed how people held their glasses, who interrupted others, who looked over someone's shoulder while pretending to listen. These were details she had always seen. Even now, they gave her comfort. They reminded her that everyone, no matter how wealthy, was still human. A waiter passed by with a tray. She took a glass of water. She stood near a sculpture shaped like a wave frozen mid-crash. The edges were smooth, clear, fluid in form, but impossible to move. She knew that feeling. Then came a voice. "Miss Evans." Charlotte turned. A woman stood nearby, older, silver hair in a low twist. Her dress was navy blue, simple but elegant. Her eyes were curious, not cold. "I am Meredith Walsh," the woman said. "I run a nonprofit that partners with Pierce Technologies." Charlotte extended her hand. "Charlotte, it is a pleasure. I heard you were coming tonight. I wanted to say, your restructuring plan from last year saved us close to $500,000. That allowed us to keep 2 clinics open in rural Colorado." Charlotte blinked. "I did not realize." Meredith smiled. "I know. That is why it matters. Quiet work still saves lives." Charlotte felt something settle inside her. Not pride, not yet, but something like it. Nathaniel walked back over. "Everything all right?" Charlotte nodded. She looked around the room again. The lights had not changed. The whispers had not stopped. But something inside her had begun to shift. She was still Charlotte Evans from Indiana. She still wore a dress bought on sale. But she also stood here, not by accident, not by invitation alone, but by choice. The conversation with Meredith Walsh lingered in Charlotte's mind long after they parted. It had been brief, but something in Meredith's tone had cut through the noise around her. It had reminded Charlotte that there was a world beyond polished smiles and perfect posture, a world that still valued results over ribbons, purpose over appearance. She walked slowly through the gallery, sipping water. Nathaniel had stepped away to speak with a foundation partner. He had given her space, not out of neglect, but out of trust. The room buzzed with muted elegance. Soft music played somewhere above the marble stairway. Crystal chandeliers threw delicate light across the faces of guests who spoke in low, careful voices. Charlotte paused near a painting. Bold strokes of color curved into one another, like thoughts that never quite formed into words. She studied it quietly. A man approached her. He looked to be in his late 60s, clean-shaven, dark blue suit, slightly wrinkled at the elbows. His presence was calm, observant. "I always liked that one," he said, nodding to the painting. "The artist grew up in foster care, never trained, just painted what he saw." Charlotte glanced at him. "It feels unfinished," she said. He smiled. "Most honest things are." He extended his hand. "Alan Keating. I manage investments for 3 of the largest public hospitals on the West Coast." Charlotte shook his hand. "Charlotte Evans." "I know," he said gently. "You are not easy to miss tonight." She raised an eyebrow. "I mean that in the best way," he added. "I have been watching the company you keep, and the way you listen." Charlotte said nothing. "Most people here talk to be seen." Alan continued. "But the smart ones know who is worth listening to." Before she could reply, another voice chimed in. "Alan, you always did have a thing for underdogs." Charlotte turned to see a woman in a deep burgundy dress, late 50s, strong presence, gold-rimmed glasses. "Do not let him charm you too fast," she said. "He likes people with quiet eyes." "Quiet eyes?" Charlotte asked. "Eyes that look not just at, but through." The woman extended her hand. "Margaret Fielding, Department of Health Policy, federal level." Charlotte felt her pulse rise. "I read your paper on telehealth and rural access," Charlotte said. "You wrote that digital solutions mean nothing without community-based training." Margaret's smile deepened. "Finally, someone who reads past the headlines." Alan laughed. "I told you she was interesting." Within minutes, the 3 of them were in quiet conversation near a sculpture installation. Charlotte spoke slowly, thoughtfully, but when she did speak, her words carried weight. She talked about small clinics, about the data she sorted late at night, about how patient outcome reports could change the way funding was distributed. She talked about the gap between corporate strategy and real-world suffering, about the spreadsheet rows that represented someone's grandmother, someone's only child, and they listened, not out of politeness, but because she made them remember why they started in the first place. More people joined. The circle around her grew, not loudly, not all at once, just a slow gathering of minds drawn to something rare, a sense of sincerity. Nathaniel watched from across the room. He said nothing, but his eyes never left her. He had brought Charlotte to the gala because he believed in her, but watching her now, he realized something else. He was learning from her. Her grace was not loud. Her intelligence did not ask for praise. But somehow, she had shifted the room. Even Bradley Carrington glanced toward the crowd, clearly surprised. He leaned over to a man beside him. "Who is she again?" The man shrugged. "I do not know. But they are listening." Charlotte did not notice the glances anymore. She was too deep in conversation, too present, too herself. The room had begun to settle into its second rhythm. Dinner would be served soon. The string quartet had moved into softer melodies. People stood in clusters, some holding glasses, others leaning in for half-whispered jokes. Charlotte stood near a table of program pamphlets. Her conversation with Margaret and Alan had just ended. They had thanked her genuinely, then promised to follow up. She was still holding her glass of water, still steadying herself in the moment. Nathaniel rejoined her, carrying 2 small plates of hors d'oeuvres. "They said you were brilliant," he said quietly. Charlotte shook her head. "I only told the truth. That is what made it brilliant," he replied. They both smiled, but the quiet did not last. Bradley Carrington was approaching. He walked with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no. The crowd around them began to thin, sensing the shift in tone. His voice rose slightly, not enough to draw attention yet, but just enough to change the air. "Well," Bradley began, tilting his head, "you are certainly making an impression tonight." Charlotte turned to face him. She kept her voice even. "I did not intend to." "That is the thing about impressions," he said. "They do not always ask your permission." Nathaniel stood beside her, still, watching. Bradley continued, "You know, I remember when I first started coming to these events, there was a kind of standard, certain etiquette, a level of polish." Charlotte said nothing. Bradley leaned in slightly. "You do realize people are watching, do you not? Some of them are wondering how you ended up here." Charlotte kept her posture upright. Nathaniel stepped forward. "That is enough." But Bradley held up his hand. "I am simply saying, appearances matter, reputation is fragile, and a night like this, well, it stays with people." He turned to Charlotte. "Tell me, what exactly do you do again?" "Fetch coffee. Schedule meetings." A few nearby guests turned their heads. The words hung heavy in the air. Charlotte looked at him, slowly, calmly. Her hands were still at her sides. Her voice, low but clear. "I translate chaos into clarity. I read data when others read headlines. I listen for what is not said. I remember what matters. And I work harder in silence than some people do with a microphone." There was a pause, one long breath of stillness. Then Margaret Fielding stepped closer. "She does more than that," Margaret said. "She understands the impact behind every number, the human cost behind every strategy." Bradley blinked. Before he could respond, Alan Keating joined them. "She gave me 3 insights tonight I have not heard from any consultant all year." Then came Meredith Walsh. "She is the reason 2 of our clinics are still open." Bradley glanced around. The circle had formed again, but this time, it was not for admiration. It was for protection. Nathaniel stepped in. I invited Charlotte because I trust her mind and her character. Bradley smirked. Of course, character. He looked at Charlotte once more. You should enjoy this attention. It will not last. Charlotte gave a soft nod. Maybe not. But I will remember who stood silent and who did not. With that, she turned slightly, not away in defeat, but forward, into the space beyond him. Bradley stayed behind, watching. But no one looked back at him. The energy of the room had shifted again. A few people approached Charlotte, quietly, kindly. A woman handed her a card. I run a mentoring program for young women in tech. I would love for them to hear you speak. Another said, You reminded me why I started this work. Thank you. Charlotte smiled. Softly. She did not say much. But her presence said everything. Nathaniel stood beside her again. They exchanged no words. But the look in his eyes said more than enough. He had seen what mattered. And now, so had everyone else. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly. Dinner service had begun. Tables were lit by candlelight. Soft conversations drifted between clinks of silverware and the quiet rhythm of classical strings. Charlotte sat beside Nathaniel at table 12. The room was calm again, but the echo of what had happened with Bradley still lingered. She stirred her water with a slow hand. Her appetite had not returned, but her mind was clear, steady. She was no longer trying to belong. She was simply being. Nathaniel watched her for a moment. He did not speak, but his hand rested lightly near hers on the white linen tablecloth. Across the room, people glanced at them more often now, some with curiosity, some with a new kind of respect, but others with confusion and quiet calculation. Nathaniel leaned closer. I need to step away for a few minutes. Charlotte nodded. He rose from his chair, walked toward the far end of the ballroom. The stage had been set for the keynote address. A sleek microphone stood at the front. A large screen behind it read, in elegant script, Innovation with Compassion Building the Future Together. Nathaniel climbed the few marble steps in silence. No introduction, no announcement. He simply appeared at the microphone. The room took a moment to notice. Then someone whispered his name, and the entire hall turned to face him. He looked calm, collected, but not distant. When he spoke, his voice was clear, steady, but deeper than usual, grounded. Ladies and gentlemen, I was asked to speak tonight about the future, about the power of innovation, and about how we build something meaningful in a world that moves too fast. He paused. The silence invited more than attention. It invited reflection. But I want to speak, just for a moment, about something else. He scanned the room, not rushed, not nervous. I want to speak about grace. There was a pause. Not the kind you see in movements or posture, but the quiet kind. The kind that does not shout, that does not demand space, but somehow fills it anyway. Charlotte sat still. Breath caught, halfway in her chest. I brought someone with me tonight, someone many of you do not know, someone who does not come from the places we often measure as success. A few heads turned, but she has shaped our work more than most realize. Her clarity has restructured broken systems. Her empathy has restored focus where it was lost. And her questions, always simple, always honest, have saved us from costly decisions more than once. He did not say her name yet, but the room knew. Nathaniel continued. She was questioned tonight. Her presence, her background, her place at this table. And I understand why. We are conditioned to protect spaces like this. We tell ourselves it is about tradition or professionalism. But really, It is about fear. A few murmurs moved through the crowd. We fear what is unfamiliar, what is humble, what does not wear armor made of status. He paused again. I used to fear those things too. Charlotte looked down. She was trying not to cry. Not here. Not now. Nathaniel S. voice softened. But she reminded me, greatness is not loud. It does not demand titles. It shows up. It listens. It sees. And when it speaks, it changes things. He looked straight toward table 12. Her name is Charlotte Evans. Now the silence was complete. No forks, no glasses, just stillness. I brought her here as my guest, not to prove anything, but because I believe in what she stands for. She is not here to fit in. She is here because she has already helped build what comes next. He stepped back from the microphone. No dramatic gesture, no bow, just a quiet nod. Then, from the back of the room, came a single clap, then another, and then a wave of applause. Slow, respectful, not for show. It grew until the chandeliers themselves seemed to tremble. Charlotte sat frozen, her hands in her lap. She looked across the table. People smiled at her, not out of politeness, but because something had shifted. Nathaniel returned to his seat. He said nothing. But when his hand brushed lightly against hers, she did not pull away. For the first time that night, she let herself breathe, really breathe. And in that breath, she understood. She had not just survived the evening, she had changed it. The applause eventually faded, but something deeper lingered. Not noise, not attention. It was respect, real, rooted, earned. Charlotte sat at table 12, her fingers lightly resting on the linen napkin in her lap. The weight of the moment had not passed. It had simply settled, like dust after a storm. People no longer looked at her the same way. They did not stare with suspicion. They observed with curiosity, a few with admiration. Margaret Fielding was the first to return. She stepped up beside Charlotte's chair. No fanfare, no flourish, just presence. You know, she said, some of us have been trying to say what he just did for years. Charlotte looked up. Her voice was soft, and Margaret smiled. He said it better. She gently touched Charlotte's shoulder. Make sure you do not disappear after tonight. We need you. Alan Keating followed. I meant what I said earlier. He began. There is a seat at my table, anytime. Not as a guest, as a partner. Then came others, 2 women from the Mayor's Council, a philanthropist with a trembling voice, an elderly man who said, You remind me of my daughter. She passed 5 years ago, but she saw people the way you do. Charlotte could barely respond. She nodded, thanked them, held their words like pieces of something sacred. And then came someone unexpected, Bradley Carrington. He did not approach directly. He hovered near the side of the room, a drink in hand, his tie slightly loosened. He watched her, hesitated. Finally, he stepped forward. He did not smile. I was wrong, he said. Charlotte looked up. I judged you, assumed things, tried to make you feel small. She said nothing. But what you did tonight, that was strength, not the kind I am used to. But maybe the kind we all need. He extended his hand. Charlotte looked at it, then slowly reached out and shook it. I appreciate you saying that, she said, but I did not do it to prove anything. I did it because I could not let it pass. He gave a slow nod. Still, it landed. He turned and walked away. No applause, no witnesses, but a small wall had cracked. Nathaniel returned from speaking with the event coordinator. He sat beside her again. Their plates had gone cold. but neither noticed. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded. "I think so." They sat in silence, but it was not empty. It was full. Full of meaning that did not need explaining. After dessert was served, the auction resumed. The mood in the room had changed. There was warmth. Conversations flowed more naturally. Charlotte found herself pulled into circles she never imagined. A woman with silver hair and a soft scarf leaned across the table. "You spoke about data earlier," she said. "Would you be willing to consult on our next public health initiative?" A younger man, perhaps in his 30s, added, "I run a youth entrepreneurship group. We could use someone who talks like you do. Not above people, beside them." It was surreal. She was no longer invisible, no longer questioned. She was included. The night wore on, but Charlotte never felt tired. Not the kind of tired that came from defending herself. She was filled with something new, a quiet energy, a sense of arrival. When the final item was auctioned and guests began to collect their coats, Charlotte stepped out onto the terrace. The air was cool and still. The city skyline sparkled in the distance. Nathaniel joined her. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then he spoke. "You changed something tonight." She looked at him. "So did you." He smiled. "People see me a certain way. Sharp, strategic, powerful." He paused, but none of that mattered until I stood beside you. Charlotte turned to him fully. "You did not have to do that." "I did," he replied. "Not just for you. For me. For everything I forgot to value." She held his gaze. "What happens now?" she asked. He did not answer right away. Instead, he reached for her hand. "We keep building," he said, "but this time, together." She did not pull away. Instead, she whispered, "I would like that." And for the first time in years, Nathaniel felt at peace. Not because the night had gone well, but because something honest had taken root. And that, he knew, was how real change always began. 2 weeks had passed since the gala. The headlines faded, the photos stopped circulating, but the memory stayed, the shift remained. Charlotte Evans was no longer just the quiet assistant behind a powerful man. She had stepped into the light, and this time, she did not fade back. Emails came in, invitations, speaking requests, proposals for projects she once dreamed about. But Charlotte took her time. She read every line, listened to her instincts. She said no to the ones that felt hollow. She said yes to the ones that spoke to something deeper. One of the first calls came from Margaret Fielding. "I meant what I said," Margaret told her. "We are restructuring the state-level Economic Advisory Council. There is a place for you, if you want it." Charlotte hesitated. She had never imagined herself in politics, never thought her name would sit beside others in that kind of space. "That feels big," she said. Margaret replied gently, "You already stepped into the room. You just need to take your seat." Charlotte smiled. She said yes. Alan Keating was next. He offered her a consulting role with his foundation. Charlotte suggested a project instead, a financial literacy program designed for low-income medical clinics. Simple, clear, built for people, not for headlines. Alan listened, then he said something she had not expected. "Lead it, your way." So she did, but Charlotte kept her rhythm. She still rode the subway, still packed her own lunch, still spent Sunday mornings walking the same block where she used to live. Nathaniel noticed all of it. He had seen others change once the spotlight turned. He had seen people rise and forget where they came from. But Charlotte stayed the same, She was steady, kind, and quietly powerful. They began to meet more often, not in boardrooms or ballrooms, but in bookstores, little parks, places where there was no image to maintain, only space to breathe. One evening, they sat on a bench beside the Hudson River. The sun had already dipped behind the skyline. Streetlights blinked on one by one. Charlotte wore an old denim jacket. Nathaniel had left his phone in the car. For a while, they said nothing. Then Nathaniel broke the quiet. "You know," he said, "I used to think love looked a certain way." Charlotte turned to him. She said nothing, just listened. "I thought it needed to be impressive, grand, the kind people talked about in magazines, but now—" He paused. "Now I think it is this. Sitting still, being real, knowing someone sees you and stays anyway." Charlotte rested her head on his shoulder. "I am not going anywhere," she said softly. In the days that followed, they became something people noticed, but not in the way they feared. It was not a scandal. It was a story. Some whispered, some rolled their eyes, but others smiled. They saw something honest between them. Even Bradley Carrington gave a nod once when they crossed paths at a leadership event. No speech, just a quiet acknowledgement. Charlotte stayed busy. She led community workshops, sat on policy panels, helped shape conversations in rooms where she used to pour coffee. But she never tried to sound impressive. She spoke like she always had, simply, clearly, with care. At one event, a young woman in the audience raised her hand. "How do you stay confident when people say you do not belong?" she asked. Charlotte paused before answering. "I do not always stay confident," she admitted. "Some days, I feel like running, but I remind myself of something important." She looked around the room. "I remind myself that what I bring is not up for permission. My ideas matter, even if others take time to see that." There was silence, then a quiet clap, then more. But Charlotte did not come for the applause. She came for the change. One evening, Charlotte walked through her old neighborhood, past the grocery store where her mother once worked, past the library where she had studied late into the night. She sat on a wooden bench near the park, the same one where she used to rest after long shifts. Everything looked smaller now, but she felt bigger inside. Nathaniel found her there. He wore jeans and a navy sweater, no chauffeur, no pretense. "I wanted to see where you began," he said. Charlotte looked around. The cracked sidewalk, the faded playground, the corner where her father once bought her ice cream. "It is not much," she said. Nathaniel shook his head. "It is everything." They sat in silence for a while. Then he reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, velvet box. Charlotte's breath caught. She looked at him, eyes wide. He opened it slowly. Inside was not a diamond. It was a silver band, simple, thoughtful. "This is not a proposal," he said gently. "Not yet. It is a promise." "A promise to what?" she asked. "A promise to stand beside you. Not above, not behind, just beside." Charlotte held the ring in her hand. She looked down at it, then at him. "I make that promise too," she said. He reached out. She slipped the ring on her own finger. And they sat like that, two people, on a bench, between a past that shaped them and a future they would choose together. The ballroom looked different now, not because the chandeliers had changed, or the marble floor had lost its shine, but because Charlotte Evans no longer felt like a stranger in it. She stood near the stage, wearing a deep navy dress, modest, strong, and graceful. a quiet contrast to the golden tones of the room. This time, she was not a guest. She was the keynote speaker. The event was a fundraiser for public education, organized by the same foundation that once barely acknowledged her presence. But tonight, they had invited her, not because she was someone's date, but because she had become a voice people listened to. Nathaniel stood near the back, letting her have the moment to herself. He had offered to sit beside her on stage. She had gently declined. "You have always had my back," she told him. "Now let me stand on my own." He understood. When the lights dimmed, the host walked on stage and gave a short introduction. And now, we are honored to welcome someone whose story speaks louder than any title ever could, Charlotte Evans. She stepped into the light. There was a pause, a breath. Then she began. "I used to believe that people like me were not supposed to be here." Her voice was calm. "Sure. I grew up in a place where dreams felt too expensive. My mother worked night shifts. My father repaired old machines in a freezing garage. We did not talk about stock options or Ivy League schools. We talked about getting by, about staying warm in winter." There was no bitterness in her tone, only truth. "But still, they taught me something. That dignity does not come from money. That worth is not earned through a last name." She paused. "And years later, I found myself in rooms like this one, surrounded by crystal and confidence, but also doubt." A few heads tilted. "I doubted myself. I listened to the voices that said, 'You do not belong here.'" Her eyes moved gently across the crowd. "But here is what I learned. Belonging is not given, it is chosen. You walk in, you sit down, you speak, even when your voice shakes." Soft nods moved across the room. "You earn your place not by pretending, but by showing up exactly as you are." She spoke about policy work, about financial systems that needed human perspective, about the importance of making decisions with empathy, not just efficiency, but more than facts. She offered story, vision, presence. When she finished, the room stood in quiet applause, not thunderous, not dramatic, but respectful, lasting. As she stepped down, Margaret Fielding came forward. "Next month, we are nominating you for the National Equity Council," she whispered. "It is not just a title. It is a seat at the table that sets federal direction." Charlotte blinked. "I do not know what to say." Margaret smiled. "You already said it, on stage." Later that evening, Nathaniel joined her by the fountain outside the venue. The night was still. The city lights reflected on the water. "You were extraordinary," he said. Charlotte shook her head, smiling. "I was honest." He took her hand. "That is what makes you extraordinary." They sat on the stone ledge for a while, shoes off, her heels beside her, his jacket folded over both their shoulders. They talked about everything and nothing, about the child at the gala who asked for her autograph, about the speech, about her mother, who had called 3 times since the event began. And then, silence again. Nathaniel looked at her. "I used to think I needed to lead alone." Charlotte tilted her head. "And now, I know better. I want a life where both of us lead. Together. Different paths. Same direction." He reached into his coat pocket again. This time, there was no silver ring. It was gold. Simple. Strong. "I am ready now. If you are?" Charlotte looked at the ring, then at him. "Yes," she whispered. No crowd, no cameras, just them. Two people who had walked through fire and still kept their gentleness. A few months later, Charlotte returned to her old hometown in Indiana. She walked into the local library, the same one where she had spent her weekends at age 15, reading biographies of people who changed the world. She walked past the old fiction section, found the dusty community board near the front desk. There, she pinned a flyer. Free financial workshop, led by Charlotte Evans. Open to all ages. No titles, no headlines, just her name, in plain print. That evening, she sat at the front of the community center, folding chairs lined up, old coffee pot on the side table, children on the floor with crayons. One woman came up and said, "You are the one from the news." Right, Charlotte smiled. "I suppose I am." The woman looked at her. "My daughter wants to be like you." Charlotte knelt slightly, so their eyes met. "Then she already is." She looked around the room, at the laughter, the shared questions, the simplicity, and she felt peace. A kind that did not come from power, or money, or recognition, but from returning and giving back. The journey that had started with a quiet invitation to a world that tried to reject her had led her full circle. Only now, she was not entering through a side door. She was opening the door for others, one conversation at a time. Sometimes, the world measures worth by money, titles, or where you come from. But real value comes from something deeper. It comes from how you treat others, from how you carry yourself in quiet rooms, from the courage to show up as you are. Charlotte Evans did not have wealth or status, but she had wisdom, she had integrity. She had the strength to speak when others wanted her silent. Her journey reminds us that we do not need permission to belong. We do not need to wear the right clothes or speak with the right accent to make a difference. What matters is the heart we bring, the truth we stand in, and the people we choose to uplift along the way. This story speaks to anyone who has ever felt overlooked or underestimated, especially in a world that often values appearance over character. So, if you are doubting yourself today, remember this: your story matters, your presence matters, and sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one that changes everything. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart or reminded you of something true, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who may need a little hope today. And if you would like more stories that speak to the quiet strength inside us all, do not forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter.